Welcome, everybody, to episode number 79 of the BeerSmith Homebrewing Show. It's early April 2014, and today my guest is Chris Graham from MoreBeer, here to talk about how to keg your beer. Today's podcast is brought to you by BeerSmith Desktop, the world's most popular software for home and professional brewing. BeerSmith 2.2 makes it easy to imagine your best beer ever, design great beer recipes, and share them with your friends. You can download a free 21-day trial copy of BeerSmith Desktop for your PC, Mac, or Linux device from BeerSmith.com. We also have video tutorials to get you started at BeerSmith.com/video. And now let's join Chris for this week's interview. I would like to welcome Mr. Chris Graham back to the show. Chris is the Chief Operating Officer at MoreBeer and More Flavor, Inc. He is also a member of the American Homebrewers Association Governing Committee and the Brewers Association Board of Directors. We've had Chris on the show twice before on podcast number 16 and number 63. Chris, it is fantastic to have you back on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Brad. Appreciate it.
So how you been doing? What's going on out there?
You know, doing really well. My twins just passed the 15-month mark, and so starting to get more sleep than I'm used to and more energy and start doing things like this again.
They have a lot of energy, don't they?
They do. They're walking, and it's pretty darn fun.
That's awesome. Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about kegging beer today, and so why don't we start out with some of the advantages of kegging beer?
Awesome. Well, I'm going to start with the one thing that for me is huge. It's the number one reason I hear people taking time off from brewing. I'll hear, oh, yeah, I used to brew, and then it sat in my carboy for a long time. I didn't feel like bottling, so I threw it away. You know, I'm going to get back into the hobby. I hear that year after year. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, and I've heard that so many times, it's ridiculous. People, you know, once they get kegging so easy over bottling that they stick with the hobby longer. It's less work. You're cleaning one keg instead of 50 bottles per 5 gallons. After you get through those, you get more control of carbonation. So you can carbonate by style. You have the ability to filter. So you can bring your kegs around with you and they're nice and clean and you're not getting sediment. You can then actually counter pressure bottle fill after filtering. And then you have packaged quality beer with zero sediment on the bottom. And the last thing is just plain cool. If I can get people to drill a hole in the refrigerator door and put a tap there, I've got you hooked. Because whoever wants someone to come over and be like, oh no, sorry, don't try that tap. It's empty right now.
I know the biggest thing for me was the time savings. I waited many years to start kegging because I thought it was too expensive. But once I made that initial investment, I was so thankful.
Yeah, you know, one of the cool things about, you talked about time savings and really it's in the cleaning. One of the things I try to get people to do right away, so a little tip is clean your kegging stuff when you're brewing. Usually over time, you'll end up with extra kegs and such. Do all that when you're cleaning and sanitizing everything else. You can reuse your sanitizer that way because you're using it at the right time. And it just kind of consolidates the work that you're using for brewing at that same time.
Well, what are some of the pieces you need to get started? I know a lot of people don't want to make that initial investment, but what do you need to get started?
Well, let's start as a kit. You know, if it's in your budget, you can get an actual kit, which will include your keg, CO2 tank, regulator, fittings, faucets, all that kind of stuff. Generally from the 150 to 250 range will get you started. So let's go over the components. First, you have the keg itself. Generally, you can get those sometimes free from friends, but usually if you're going to pay, you'll get them $50 to $60 used, all the way up to $120 for brand new kegs. CO2 tank, typically you can get for $80 to $100, depending on what size. CO2 regulator, $40 to $70, and all the fittings and a very basic faucet, talking about $20. If you want to get a through the door tap setup, you're talking $45 to $100. If you want to get a tower to put on top of a fridge or counter, you're talking $100 and up. And then a lot of people will convert a chest freezer into a fridge, so you'll need a temp controller, and you're talking $60 to $100.
So what's the all-up cost we're looking at here roughly to get started?
I'd say a good budget to set for yourself is roughly $300, which isn't bad considering what you get for that.
Well, let's start with the first big component, which is the CO2 tank and regulator. What do you recommend there?
So typically, if you're buying a kit, you're going to get one of these beautiful CO2 tanks. They're honed aluminum. They look aesthetically very pleasing. You're going to get that in the mail. You're going to bring it to a place thinking they're just going to want to fill your tank right there. And usually, for economies of scale, they don't like to fill per tank. They fill a whole bunch of them at a time. So they're going to typically want to swap you out. And typically, what they swap you out with is an old, rusty looking painted steel tank. However, those work just fine. So just keep that in mind when you're getting them. Maybe you'll get one that's shiny on aluminum and full, but usually you're going to get a painted steel. To be honest, those aren't going to be the showpiece of your kegerator usually, so you don't usually care. But let's start with CO2 itself. It's a liquid. So when I say 5 pounds, it is actually 5 pounds of liquid CO2 filled into that tank. And then where you're going to keep that tank upright at all times when serving or using the CO2
Mhm.
because you're going to be taking gas off of that liquid. Um, a lot of people will want to put that CO2 tank. A lot of questions we get is, do I put the CO2 tank and regulator in the fridge or out of the fridge? For longest life of the regulator, you'd put it outside of the fridge. But for most people, to keep things clean, easy, contained, we just put the CO2 tank and regulator in the fridge with everything else.
Yeah, I eventually moved mine outside because I need more room for beer.
I was going to say it depends on how many kegs you're serving. That a lot of times it'll end up outside, and a lot of us will end up in the long run with two tanks. We'll have a 20 pounder because you get 4 times as much CO2 in it as our main tank, and then we'll have a 5 pound backup. The 5 pound backup is great for when the 20 pounds runs out, as well as when you want to take it to a picnic, a party, or anything like that. Carrying 20 pounds of CO2 is actually, the steel tanks probably weigh another 20 pounds. So you got 40 pounds that you're dragging around with you.
So they come in, what is it, 5, 10, 20 pounds of major sizes, I think?
Those are the majors. I've seen these cute little 2.5 pounders, and I've seen 50 pounders that how you move those around, I don't know. But my welding shop has those. We call them D tanks. So they come in a range of sizes, but 5 and 20 are the most common that you'll find out there.
Right. What about the kegs themselves? What do you recommend there?
5 years ago, I would have said just buy used. Everybody buys used, the easiest things. But nowadays, the supplies are they're dwindling. So used is all of a sudden becoming an option because the price of used, as they keep going up and up and up, new kegs are not that much more expensive anymore. Plus, you can get parts and fittings for them a lot easier. So, but still, you're talking $60 to $70 used versus $100 to $120 new. So it's still a big enough gap that most people are still used, but you're seeing that big gap getting closer and closer.
Right. A few years ago, you could get them by the millions, right?
Exactly, and I'd buy them by the truckloads, and I still do when I can get my hands on them. But the main thing is that they were used for soda. Back in the 60s and 70s and even early 80s, they were called post mix, so you had carbonated soda in one of these things, and every place that served soda had these underneath these spigots that you'd get the soda out of. Nowadays, everyone's moved to bag in a box, which is just a pure concentrate. They carbonate water in line and blend them right where you get them, so that the soda itself only stores this much. So this much is a week's worth of soda for McDonald's versus 20 or 30 of these kegs and all the handling of that.
Right. Well, what about the different styles? I guess there's two different styles of kegs.
There's two different common styles for homebrewing. I'll address one really quick, and that's a Sankey keg, which most of us don't use for homebrewing because you can't get in them. They have one valve at the top. They're great for commercial beer, but really tough for homebrewers to use.
Right. So that's what you used at the kegger at college, right?
Exactly. If you remember hand pumping, that awesome natural light at the college party, that's what it was. So for the homebrewer, we're going to typically use two different styles of kegs. We're going to use ball lock fittings and pin lock fittings. Brad, if you could pull up a picture
Sure.
off the iPad, here we have a pin lock fitting. And as you can see on the body, on the sides, you have pins, and they actually have 2 pins for, I believe, um, beer and 3 pins for gas. But any way you look at them, you can't accidentally use the wrong style body connect. And on the same pictures, if you go to the red fitting with the black bottom, that's the quick disconnect, and you can actually see at the bottom there the where the post goes in and locks onto the keg. Real slick, easy style to use, almost idiot proof. The ball lock fittings are even faster to get on and off because they have no pins. Um, but you got to keep in mind which one is the beer and which one is the gas. So
Yeah, I pulled one of those up here.
On here we're showing the beer fitting. It's black, so it's easy to remember beer, and the black fitting, the B and the B. Pull up the body post on there for the ball lock.
Oops.
Nope.
There we go.
There we go. This one happens to be a gas fitting, not a liquid fitting, and you can tell by that notch that's on the part you'd put a wrench on.
Mhm.
And that's actually true throughout the whole pneumatic world. You always know the gas fittings because they're notched like that. So there's usually little tricks on the kegs, whether they be a little bump in the handle. Sometimes you'll see in and out, but you got to remember which one's which, because if you accidentally put the wrong fitting on and you get it to lock, sometimes you need either a very good wrench or sometimes a sawzall to get that fitting off of there.
That would be bad.
Yeah. So Pepsi used ball locks and Coke used pin locks. If you could pull up the picture of the lid, I'll tell you why we used ball locks for years.
There we go.
Okay, so on that lid, you'll see that there's a nice, easy ring. Sometimes it's a flip over or whatever. It's a way of releasing the gas easily from the keg.
Sure.
Where Coke went to a fixed system. I'll hold it up to the camera, so if you want to come back to mine, this is a traditional Coke pressure relief valve. The other way they did it, where they had a line in the keg lid itself that would split at 60 psi, and that was just their safety regulation. Either one of those didn't allow you as the user to let the gas out easily. So we've recently had to switch to selling used pin lock kegs. So when we get our thousands of them, we buy thousands of those lids so that you get the better user experience of being able to pull the ring to let the gas out.
Yeah, I certainly like having the rings on mine to be able to, mostly to be able to purge the keg when you start it up,
Exactly. There's a number of different reasons why you want to be able to do it, or even when you're done, just to get the lid off. It's just easier to let the gas out, to take that off. Excuse me. So that's usually what the main difference is for them. The reason I usually get people to start off one way or the other, it doesn't really matter if you go pin lock or ball lock. They both have their advantages, and as long as you get the pull ring, who cares? But the reason someone like myself, who's been doing this for a long time, has both is so that I can handle a non-standard keg. I've had kegs from margaritas, sodas, sour beers, just a number of different reasons I want to identify this is a non-standard. This is not a pale ale, an IPA, a lager, and I don't want to use the same equipment when serving, whether it be at different pressures, sometimes different gases, and especially I don't want to cross-contaminate my lines, whether it's a sour beer or a soda. I definitely don't want my serving lines to accidentally have the wrong style of liquid go through it.
Yeah, that would be bad to cross your sour beer lines with your regular beer lines.
Sour is one that you can always make those other ones into sours for later, but it's when you accidentally do a soda, a root beer especially, that there's the worst tasting beer in the world is an IPA that was run on lines that had soda in them before. Trust me, I know this.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you next, what about refrigerators? Why is a refrigerator so important when you keg? A lot of people, I've had people try and keg without a refrigerator. It doesn't work that well.
I'm just going to tell you off the get-go. I've known people who are like, I'm going to prove you wrong. It's not impossible, but it's silly to do. We'll get into carbonation a little later in the podcast, but that's the first thing is really being able to carbonate using forcing CO2 into solution. You got to have it cold and you have to have it constant. And that's really impossible, either just keeping it warm or trying to use ice to get it down there. Plus, it's the whole idea is it's a one-stop shop. You carbonate it and you serve out of it, so it's just so much better when you have a refrigerator than rather than trying to buy or make ice to do this when you are going to be serving the beer.
So you really do need an extra fridge or a lot of room in your existing kitchen fridge to be able to pull this off, right?
If you can do it in your kitchen fridge, you're not married. I can guarantee you that. In college, I did cut a ring in all the different shelves so that my keg fit in there. And that sounded like a great idea at first. And then I realized pretty quickly, just get another fridge. Craigslist, beer clubs, everywhere you'll find used fridges for cheap, if not free. I actually did that for a while and realized, yeah, it's cheap, but they're so energy inefficient usually that I started going to chest freezers. And yes, you do have to get a controlling mechanism to turn them to not freeze, but your energy bill goes way down, and they usually actually can hold many kegs. You open the lid so that the cold air doesn't spill out of them. So they actually end up making great serving vessels, as well as actually good fermentation vessels as well.
Well, let's talk about taps. I know there's a wide variety of tap options out there.
Well, let's talk about what a tap is. All of us know something like this as a tap.
Right.
But technically, a tap is what taps the keg itself. So there's just a terminology issue there. Now, with that being said, everyone talks about a tap, and that's what the beer flows out of in their brain. Faucets are what they are. So let's talk about them. If you can pull up that one picture you had of, there you go. What you see on the right-hand side of that is a traditional picnic faucet, Cobra faucet. Those are the different terms I've heard for that. You hold the little lever down, beer flows through. They're very handy. No matter what, get one of these. So if you're buying a kit, don't think, ooh, I want to get the kit that gets me beyond one of these. These are great for taking with you on the road. These are great for if you do end up with the chest freezer with 5 or 6 beers, of taking small samples out. Just extremely handy to have. So that's kind of the picnic faucet, the cheapest, I think $5 or $6. And you will use it for the lifetime of you brewing and kegging.
Yep.
So then you get into, I want to drill a hole through my refrigerator door, which highly encourage.
Something a little more permanent.
Yeah. So typically to get the beer through, you'd go with a traditional shank.
Mm-hmm.
And then the faucet goes onto the shank itself. So now let's talk about traditional faucets. This is what's been around for years. Those of us who have been doing this for a long time, this was the only option. When you closed the faucet, the seal happened right there.
And right at the base of the faucet for people listening on audio here.
Gotcha. And then you had a whole big chamber that the remainder of the beer just sat in and hardened and got sticky. And for a beer establishment that serves beer all day, every day, not a big deal to deal with these because you got beer flowing through. But for a home brewer, you might go on vacation for a few days, you come back, and I've seen a lot of people break the threaded stem at the top that you put your faucet handle on, or somewhere in between to where the mechanism is, because the sugar is built up so much and stuck. So for cleaning and for just not sticking, there are now sealed forwards. I know it's going to be real hard to see in there, but the seal actually happens right here as opposed to all the way back here. So this is still filled with beer in it when it's in the closed position. And when you open it, it also has a lot less mechanism in here. So a lot less to disrupt the beer flow, causing foaming issues or anything like that.
So the forward seal one has the seal very close to the end of the tap for those listening on audio, right?
Right at the end of the faucet. So there's very little area that needs cleaning in between usage, if any. You have some other faucets. This would be your traditional stout style faucet.
Mm-hmm.
There's the thing that most people don't get about this is that there's a plate in here with pinholes, and that's what's stripping out the CO2 during the serving to give it the cool cascading effect. You also traditionally use a mixed gas. That's for a future podcast, but that's what that style faucet does for you.
Well, talk for a minute about the stout faucet. A lot of people don't know how you use those.
So a lot of people want to get into these pretty quick, but typically the proper use of one of these is with a different gas mix. It's usually a 70% or 75% nitrogen, 20 to 25% or 25 to 30% CO2. You carbonate with that and you serve with that, and you typically do it at a much higher pressure. These are pretty well-made faucets to handle those higher pressures because you want to keep your CO2 volumes up. And the CO2 volumes in solution is what we call carbonation. So you need a whole different serving set from the tank to the regulator to the faucet. Needs to be its own rig, if you will, to be able to serve a traditional dry stout, Guinness, for example.
Mm-hmm. So a very specialized kind of faucet there.
Yep. But you can do some cool things. Some of my favorite are ESBs, things that you don't want the high carbonation level, that the beer is really all about the malt characters. That's the style of beer you'd serve with that.
So for somebody just getting started, you recommend a basic picnic tap, right?
Basic picnic tap, and most of the kits you ever going to see out there are going to have them. And even if you're going to go through a shank through the door to a traditional faucet, you'll still want that picnic faucet for taking your beer to go or for tasting things as they're aging.
And then the next upgrade above that would be moving up to something like, through the door. Do you recommend the forward seal?
I do. Once you're considering any kind of traditional faucet, whether that's on a tower or through the door, I am a huge fan of these. These have, I think, changed the industry. These particular ones are also made of stainless as opposed to chrome-plated brass, so they'll hold up forever.
The forward seal, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's move on to keg lines. What do you need to know about keg lines and keg line balancing?
Oh, nothing. That's easy.
That's easy.
They all work the same. No, your traditional setup is usually a short run. So I'm going to focus mainly on short run systems. The whole concept is you want to balance the CO2 level that you're going to be serving with and that hopefully you're carbonated with how much resistance to get to your faucet. So if you can put that picture up there.
Sure. This is a traditional keg line.
Traditional keg line, that actually has a double loop there. So that is usually somewhere 5 to 6 feet, sometimes 7 feet of line, depending on which manufacturer of the tubing. But that's usually 3/16 inner diameter tubing. So it's a pretty small inner diameter. Mm-hmm. And those usually get you about 3 PSI per foot. So if you're at, say, 12 feet of or 12 PSI that you want to be pouring at.
Which might be typical, yeah.
Yep. A lot of people go with 4 feet of tubing. Mm-hmm. I usually recommend going with a slightly longer tubing setup because most of the time that 3 PSI is more of a theoretical PSI of resistance as opposed to actual. 2.2 is probably more like an actual that most people get when trying to truly balance that flow.
So when you say 3 PSI per foot, it means you're losing about that much pressure every foot of keg line, right?
Exactly. Let's go with you're adding resistance for every foot. And that's really what's giving you your balanced pour. So if you're noticing your beer gushing out of your faucet, there's a couple reasons. A foaming issue is totally different. But if it's just pouring with such force, either you have too much force on your keg itself, or you don't have enough resistance in your line. So the first thing I usually go over with people when they say, hey, I have a foaming issue, is going to be the resistance that you have set up to balance the pour.
Yep.
So you can get into longer pours. Quarter inch gives you about 0.85 psi per foot. Different types of vinyl versus polyethylene have different resistances. Stainless.
So basically, you change the size of the keg line as you're adjusting the length, right?
Exactly. And so if you need to do a traditional setup, a shank through the door, one of those Cobra faucets, you're usually talking no more than 6 feet of tubing is going to cover you for most everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing something like, hey, I want to have this tower here and my cold keg over there, and I need 20 feet, now you're getting into long line, and there's a whole different realm of balancing those, because really it's not just about how much pressure. Now it's about how much temperature loss I'm going to have through that whole thing. It's very complicated to get right. That's my best bet.
Right, because those keg lines aren't refrigerated out there, right?
They aren't for most home people, but if you go to a bar, they are.
Right.
And so the biggest thing I can tell you is, most of the time, if you're having foaming issues and you have a traditional faucet, it's usually because this is warm and it takes a while to get this cold. So if you pour, let's say, 1 pint and the first pint is all foam, the next pint is 50-50, and the third pint is perfect, that's all the issues are usually because of the temperature of your faucet.
Well, let's walk through the actual kegging process now. How does it go? And how's it different than bottling?
So the first thing is, you talk traditionally, if you're bottling, you're going to rack from your fermenter into a bottling bucket and add a sugar.
Mm-hmm.
We're traditionally going to skip that. We're not going to need to add this sugar because we're going to force carbonate the beer, meaning we're just going to use the liquid CO2 to, take the gas off and force it into solution. CO2 is CO2. I hear a lot of people like, oh, I get a better mouthfeel, better flavor, better anything when I naturally carbonate over when I force carbonate. It's not the CO2 that's the difference. It's probably the maturation that you're letting the beer do that's really making the big difference between the flavors.
So, you can naturally carbonate a keg, but it's not really needed.
Absolutely. If you naturally carbonate a keg, you're going to have some of the sediment that's going to come up through in the first few pours, or you're going to have to cut the dip tube in order to not pull that through. So traditionally, a keg's pretty simple. I probably don't have good enough lighting to let you see down there, but
that's pretty good.
There's a pickup tube that I don't know if you can see down there, but we're going to traditionally just go right from the fermenter right into the keg itself.
So you just siphon it right in.
Siphon it right in. There are some tricks to keep it. The more you can keep that sealed, the less other things are getting in that same process. I traditionally like to take apart the body connects, clean everything, put CO2 or put sanitizer all the way to the top, sanitize everything, put my lid on, and actually push my sanitizer out. Then my whole keg is full of CO2, so that as I'm filling the beer, I'm not oxidizing it because the keg is full of CO2 instead of full of air.
So you definitely want to avoid splashing and oxygenating the beer just like you would with bottling, right? You want to keep it all, keep all the oxygen out of there.
Exactly. Once fermentation's over, oxygen's your enemy at this point. So you're going to fill that up all the way to the top. And if you did it with the lid open, then now you want to go in and seal your lid. You can fill with the lid closed, but you'll need a fitting to go on the end of your racking setup to go through the beer side, and a way to vent the air or the CO2 in here to allow the keg to fill. But either way, you now have your thing full.
You got the beer inside. You got the keg. You're getting ready to close it, I think.
Exactly. So most people want to just force the I call this the latch
The lid,
close.
yeah.
But the actual locking mechanism, they just
Right.
want to force it closed like that and call it a day. When you get into especially used, it's hard to see on video, but there's lots of little imperfections in that lip for over years getting dropped and whatnot happening to it.
I've had mine leak a few times too.
Exactly. The guys at Coke and Pepsi weren't exceptionally gentle. So what I typically have people do is actually this is technically called the bail.
Mm-hmm.
Hold the bail up like this, put your gas on, and let the lid find its own seat. Usually 8 to 10 psi or more will allow you to do that pretty easily. And you'll hear it leaking. You kind of let it sit, let it move around a little bit, and then you'll hear it seal up.
So probably a little pressure there with the CO2.
Exactly. And that allowed the lid to move just enough to find the perfect seat. If you're having a major issue getting that, a little bit of lube on the O-ring itself also helps. Silicone food grade lube will work perfect for that. So now that we sealed it up, now we have to carbonate it.
Yep.
And so, carbonation, always fun. So there's kind of 3 concepts in carbonation, and I've been teaching people to carbonate for years. So I smile when I get into this because everyone wants it fast. That's the typical way. Everyone wants everything fast. And they're like, oh, I keg my beer so I can serve it tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Deal.
Why not?
Exactly. So let's go through the 3 concepts to get you there. First, you need cold beer to carbonate it.
It's not going to carbonate at room temperature very well.
Very well. STP is a governing way of carbonation. It's standard temperature and pressure. I've sent you over a PDF that I believe you're going to have.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. Absolutely.
Perfect. People can download it. I've got all kinds of stuff in there, but one of the things I have is a carbonation chart. And this really helps you say, like, ooh, I'm going to make an IPA. What volumes of CO2 do I want to get in my liquid to have the proper pour and the proper flavor? So the 3 ways of doing it is, first, you got to get it cold. Then you can do the first way. And I'm not a huge fan, as you can tell probably by my facial expressions, but that is to literally shake the CO2 into solution. If you're going to do it, if you have to have beer quick, that is a pretty cheap and easy way to do it. And that's put your pressure on until you hear the CO2 stop going in. I recommend at that point, unless you have a good CO2 system with one-way preventers, take the quick disconnect off, shake the keg, put it back on. You'll hear the CO2 go in. And what you're doing is increasing the surface of liquid to the CO2 to allow the absorption to happen. And at the cold temperatures, the absorption will happen. You can roll the keg on the ground. You can shake it. My wife has one of those big exercise balls for, they're big rubber ones that are filled with air and they work your core and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I sit on those when I'm doing the show sometimes.
Perfect. Well, you'll find if you put a CO2, not CO2, if you put a full corny keg on there, it actually has a perfect little jiggle. So you barely have to move it with your wrist and it'll bounce up and down. And it's not a bad way to do it. You can do it kind of 2 ways. You can look at your carbonation chart and say, like, okay, it says 12 PSI. You can hedge your bet and go up to 15, 20 to get to even faster getting there. Or you can keep it at 12 and keep doing it. If you keep it at 12, it's going to take a long time to find when the liquid finally absorbs the CO2 to the head pressure. If you keep the CO2 way up, then you're going to get the liquid up to that level faster. The problem is if you go over to the desired CO2, uncarbonating a beer is a royal pain. There you go.
There's the big exercise balls. Yeah.
Hey, Brad, careful what you Google. Sometimes those Google image searches can be a little scary.
I think this one came out okay, but yeah.
Oh, that one came out great. So that's the first way, is to shake the CO2. The next way a lot of people like to do it, and the misconception is that they think it's the right way to do it, because breweries often do it, is if you could pull up the pictures we have on your iPad, there's one of a stone on a keg lid.
Sure. Yeah, I'll have it up in just a second. Go ahead.
Perfect. So the idea is putting the CO2 at the bottom of the liquid through a very small opening. These sintered stones, you can get all the way to a 0.2 micron opening. So when the CO2 comes through, it makes these tiny little bubbles. And then those bubbles float up and they have a high likelihood of being absorbed into the liquid. Breweries do it in big, huge tanks, and they can actually carbonate their beer pretty quick. But they have a very control. They're putting it at the very bottom of the big tank, and that has to get all the way to the top. They have ways of opening the top up minutely to let excess pressure build up.
Mm-hmm.
And they do the same thing every day. So they have their systems dialed in to perfectly carbonating their beer that way. The same risk is involved of over carbonating your beer. Plus, now you're introducing something else into the beer, introducing risk of bacteria. The keg lid system is probably one of the cooler ones because then you can take it out. So it's not sitting in there for the whole time you're serving the beer. There's one with it's a side profile and it has a black tube going to a stone.
Here we go. I think I got it. This is it. Perfect. Right here.
That's the one. So then you can move it keg to keg, which then makes it pretty convenient if you're carbonating a lot of kegs and you need to do it quickly.
So that's pretty cool. So did you actually drill a hole in the top of the keg to put the fitting in? How does that work?
We weld a stem in there and we weld a body connect post so that you could screw the body connect off like you would a keg.
Oh, I see.
So you could change it from ball to pin lock and you can move it keg to keg.
And then you got the stone at the bottom for carbonating.
Exactly. So
very cool.
It's cool, but again, is it necessary?
Not really needed.
And does it add an extra risk? And I think it does. So if you need beer carbonated fast, that's probably the better way to do it because you can pinpoint it a little bit more. And the third method, which no one ever wants to hear, it's the unsexy method, but it's the best method, and it's what I use for two reasons, is to let it sit. Find your carbonation chart, find the temperature that you keep your chest freezer or fridge at, find the volume of CO2 you want, which, let's be honest, most of us carbonate and serve our beer at a range. We don't typically have one beer at this level and one beer at this level and one beer at this level, or you need a pretty fancy CO2 system that pushes all those different carbonations so you can pinpoint each keg. Most of us go with a 10 to 12 range on their CO2 regulator and a 39 to 42 degree range of temperature.
Yep.
You may like it colder, some might like it warmer, but with that in mind, I rarely really sit and fiddle with my CO2 pressure per style, unless I'm really going for a wheat beer with a higher CO2 volume, or a sour beer where I really want to dial that pressure down.
I set mine at 12 and let it go usually.
That's most of us right there. So the idea is,
and then I guess you can play with the keg line length too a little bit if you want a slightly different serving pressure.
Exactly. You have the serving pressure versus the actual liquid carbonated pressure.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't actually change the carbonation pressure, but
yeah. But for the most part, you find that dialed in, and then you just leave it. And if you just leave it for roughly 7 days cold at those temperatures, you're gonna have perfectly carbonated beer, not over carbonated. And guess what? You matured your beer cold for a week. Cold maturation is fantastic for most young beers to really get them drinkable quick.
So it really only takes a few days for it to get started carbonating, and then full carbonation takes exactly how long, roughly?
I tend to tell people it's 5 to 7 days. I've had it take a little bit longer, and I've had it take a lot less time. But generally, if you could do yourself a favor and not drink that beer for a week, you're actually going to have a much better tasting beer as well. But 5 to 7 days. Yeah,
I know when it gets fully carbonated, you get those nice fine bubbles in it, whereas initially it's just kind of sort of big bubbles, I guess,
Exactly. And the one thing to remember is if you probably didn't filter your beer, you didn't go from keg to keg through a filter before you carbonated your first time, especially. You have something called cold break. And so from when you were in your bottling days, you'd put your beer in the fridge. Sometimes you'd put your beer in the fridge carbonated, perfectly clear. You go look at it 12, 24 hours later, it's hazy. Then you come back to it a few days later and it's clear and there's sediment at the bottom. That's cold break. That's typically falling out of suspension, and that the cold haze comes in and then leaves. It drops out over time. So with your kegging, if you let it sit a week, you're going to go through that cold haze and the drop usually. So you end up with the sediment at the bottom of your keg. Depending on the style of beer, how much you brought over from your fermenter of trub and sediment, to how much you're going to have in the bottom of that keg. Sometimes you end up with a very fine sediment layer. If you used
Mhm.
OO2 yeast and you cold crashed before you kegged it, you can end up with almost nothing. And if you don't pick your keg up and move it, you may never have any get into your glass. But I just warn people, the first few glasses, you might see pretty hazy and such, because you are pulling from the bottom of the keg as opposed to the top.
Makes sense. Yeah, you end up with a little bit of sediment there.
Yeah, so if you're going to move your keg, bring it to a wedding, bring it to a party, a festival, and you didn't filter, give the beer a chance. Let it settle for a few hours if possible. I did a wedding one time and, brought it there an hour before we were going to serve, and that was the hugest mistake. I was just new into the hobby. If I could have, I would have said, "Hey, let me bring that over 4 or 5 hours ahead of time, ice it, let it sit." Probably would have had a much better, clearer beer that we were serving with. No, let's face it, it was a wedding with free beer. Nobody complained, but I would have liked the beer to look clearer.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I wanted to go back just for a second. We didn't talk about regulators, and that's my fault. I think I skipped it somewhere along the way. But I want to talk about 1-dial regulators, 2-dial regulators. What do you recommend for somebody just starting out?
Let's go over the anatomy real quick. This is what you're going to get in most traditional setups.
Right.
You got your part that attaches to the tank itself.
Mm-hmm.
You have a gauge that tells you how much gas is left in your tank. It's pretty misleading. It's the pressure of the gas off the liquid. So it's not all that great of being like all the way up high when you first get it and all the way out. Usually it actually just hovers about 500 to 800 if it's sitting in the fridge, and then all of a sudden it starts going down. When you see it start going down, typically that's an
time to go to the store.
Time to either have your backup or go to the store, because you don't want to run out somewhere midway. So it's not what most people think, but I think they'll understand it better knowing that it usually stays in one place. The other quick tip is, most of the time you have a tare weight on your CO2 tank. You can actually weigh it to know how much liquid CO2 is left. And a lot of people, we do swaps here. A lot of people bring us gas, and I'll put it on the scale for them real quick, and they'll realize, oh geez, I still have 3 pounds of CO2 left, and that's over 50% full in a 5-pound tank.
Sure.
So I'm like, hey, save yourself some money. And a lot of times they're like, no, I'll just take it, and I'll take that tank home and use it myself. The most important gauge is up top. This is the one that, and they're usually 0 to 60, 0 to 30. Usually they have 2 readings. You have PSI and bar. You want the PSI rating. And then you have adjustment valve. And this is, you're going to turn it to go up in pressure or down in pressure. Sometimes it's a threaded piece that you would use a screwdriver.
Mine has a screwdriver on it, I think.
Yeah, those are great if you're going to ever be in an environment where your friends want to tweak with it, because they always think they know how to fix foaming issues. These are great for yourself because you just twist it with your hand to adjust it up and down.
Great.
So that's a single body, 1 pressure gauge. You can get one of 2 options if you want to do more pressures. So you can get one that has this, but then instead of a high pressure gauge here, it actually goes to another body and has a high pressure gauge coming off of that. And then you can get a 3 and a 4. They're very expensive. And really, like we talked about before, unless you're really doing all kinds of different pressures, they're not really needed. Another way to do it is they're called slaves. So this is a primary regulator.
Right.
You can also have an inline slave. So instead of a high pressure here, it'll just have a barb for low pressure, and looks just like this. And you can step down the pressure. So you can tee off your gas line and go to something that allow you to step down the pressure. You can't amplify it, but you can knock it down.
So, Chris, I often kick myself for not starting kegging a whole lot earlier. Why do people wait so long to get started kegging?
I think cost is usually the number one thing. People are know that it is a $300-ish investment to get myself into kegging. Sometimes it's space. If you started in college in a dorm room like I did, it'd be hard to sneak that whole kegerator in your dorm room. But usually it's cost.
I'm sure the RA wouldn't notice at all.
Exactly. And then, to be quite honest, some people enjoy bottling. And so I'm usually of the mindset of enjoy bottling until you don't enjoy it and then move to kegging. But if bottling is like the thing that's stopping you from brewing more beer or stopping you from dealing with this full carboy of beer, then get to it. It's so much easier. You get more control, and it's just more enjoyable. And keep in mind, you can share the final product, and we'll go into that here.
Well, that's what I was wondering. It brings me right to my next question, which is if you wanted to bottle a couple bottles for competition or something like that, or maybe to give to your friends, what are your options there?
So let's start with the most simple thing. If you're going to a club event that night, you're going over to a friend's house, and you want to bring some beer, those types of simple things. If you bring up the picture of the Cobra faucet, you'll see on there's actually a perfect 3/8 barb, it's not even barbed, it's just pipe that on the right hand side you have the part you trigger with your finger, and the other side's just a little tube.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 3/8 tubing fits over that perfectly. Oftentimes, if I'm doing something that night, I'll just slip a little piece of tubing long enough to go to the bottom of a bottle, clean and sanitize the bottle, especially like a flip top style bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Fill that real quick, close it. For the most part, I'm going to have good carbonated beer that night or even the next day.
So that's the whole concept behind growlers, right?
Exactly. And that's the idea. You get a growler filled, you'll see those usually at a bar, and they'll put hopefully a little piece of tubing or something. One, so they waste less beer because they have less foaming. And two, it kind of allows the beer to be less oxygenated because it's not pouring through the air to fill the vessel up. But the whole goal of that is drink it over the weekend. You're going to have good beer. Let it sit for more than 48 hours. That oxygen starts playing into it.
So growler's one option.
Growler or any kind of bottle, but just simple like that. A beer gun. I have a picture of that on there. John Blickman designed that. It's very, very popular, very simple to use. And it does a little purge system. So you can put gas into the bottle first, then do it. Works quite well. People swear by them. And I'd say for 99% of your bottling needs, it's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're really hardcore into competition, or you want to make, let's say, samples that you're trying to get investment money to become a commercial brewery or whatnot, I have a picture in here of a counter pressure bottle filler. This really lets you dial in. It allows you to seal the bottle, purge the bottle, hold a pressure in the bottle, and control how much pressure you're letting out when you're filling the bottle, hence the name counter pressure bottle filler.
Yeah, I've used those. It's like a 3-step process to fill a single bottle.
Exactly. So that's really for your serious competition. Or, we actually have had quite a few small breweries buy those over the years to just do a concept situation, whether they want to bring their commercial beer to an event, enter into a competition or whatnot, but you wouldn't want to fill, 300 cases off of one of those. My friend Jamil and I did that for NHC when it was in Oakland. And first off, your hand is just numb by the time you're done. And it's just a ton of work.
It's a lot of work. There's no doubt. Well, Chris, we're getting near the end, but I wanted to ask you if you had any closing thoughts about kegging.
I tell people, stay within your comfort zone. So if money's the major issue, take it one step at a time. Go with the very basic system. See if you can find a free fridge. You don't have to go with shanks and faucets and all these things right away. You add those on. Everything is kind of piecemeal once you do it. So just take it step by step, stay in your comfort zone, and anything you buy up front, typically is going to be handy to have later. So don't be fearful of, oh, if I buy that now, I won't want that later.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Chris, I want to ask you what's going on at MoreBeer. Give you a minute here at the end.
Well, the biggest thing we've got going on, and will continue to go on for a long time, forever, hopefully, is we opened up a distribution center out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania last year. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast, but I always like to talk about it. This allows us to hit 88% of our customers in 2 days or less. So for you, Brad, it's a 2-day transit time to get from PA to you.
Absolutely.
Sometimes even one. I'm finding a lot of customers tell me down in DC area, the Carolinas, that it's really only 1 day, even though FedEx tells us it's 2. Right now, we are giving away a trip to Belgium, all expenses paid, airfare, everything for 2. And so it's the on our homepage of our website. Go there, you enter to win. It's really you don't have to buy anything. You just put in a few things, basically your name, zip code, email address, and that you agree to the terms and conditions. That's it. The contest ends at the end of April. You can enter every day. So it's an insane trip. You get.
I want to go to Belgium too.
Well, not only do you go to Belgium, you get guided tours into breweries that you can't get into on your own. So it's the very first tab that was on there, and it takes just a second to enter. You're in the second deck right now.
It'll cycle through in a minute, I'm sure.
Exactly.
I'll keep an eye on it and flip when it goes.
So the second thing we're going to be giving away starting May 1st is a trip to Siebel's advanced homebrewing class. I've been teaching that for years, and it's a great class. It's a 1-week class at the end of July. So we give away the class. You have to get there and you have to stay. You have to find a hotel and all that, but you get the class for free. It's a couple $1,000 class, and is really Ray Daniels, Randy Mosier, Chris White, and myself.
I was going to say, Siebel is one of the top institutes for brewing in the whole country, right?
It's one of the oldest ones in the world, as far as I've heard. And so they do classes from A to Z. So a lot of people who've taken the class have gone on to open breweries, have taken other classes at Siebel, and it's just a ton of fun. We do a hands-on brew day, and that's my specialty. You brew on one of my brew sculptures, and we go through the entire brew day together. The other thing we have is we've worked with this company who's been making some pretty innovative products. The first product they have is this stainless brew bucket. It's a very price point conscious item, but gets you into stainless, gets you some of the benefits of a conical bottom. There it is.
Mm-hmm.
Very well made. They're also going to release a conical that'll be more expensive, but it'll be less than the traditional ones on the market. That'll be coming out in a few months. And we're just expanding our product lines, bringing in new grains, bringing in a ton of hops. We've got a new antimicrobial tubing for serving coming out here pretty soon. We're going to have a new BPA free, also PVC free beer line tubing option coming out here very soon. So lots of new things coming out.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate you being on the show. Appreciate you being here. Real quick, is there anything else you wanted to add?
That's it.
Well, thank you for being on the show again. My guest was Chris Graham. He is the Chief Operating Officer at MoreBeer. He's also on the AHA Governing Committee and the Brewers Association Board of Directors. Chris, it's fantastic having you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you to Chris Graham from MoreBeer for joining me this week. A reminder, you can get your free 21-day trial of BeerSmith desktop at BeerSmith.com and video tutorials to get you started at BeerSmith.com/video. Also, if you haven't done so, please sign up for my newsletter. It's on the right sidebar at BeerSmith.com. You just enter your name and your email address in there. I'll send you a high-quality homebrewing article every single week, and I won't let your inbox up with spam. Join tens of thousands of people on the list for free. Just enter your name and email address on the right sidebar at BeerSmith.com. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.